Introduced to Australia almost 100 years ago, cane toads are an ugly as hell pest that have decimated large parts of this country. Now, a crack squad of toad killers has a bold plan to stop the amphibious a-holes from reaching the precious pilgrim.
Picture an animal so toxic it can stop a crocodile's heart, brought down by something smaller than your fingernail. That is not an exaggeration. That is a documented event, filmed in the Northern Territory, and it is rewriting what scientists thought they knew about one of the worst biological invasions in modern history. For nearly 90 years, Australia has been losing a war it never asked to fight. The enemy was never a lion, a virus, or an army. It was a toad. A slow, lumpy, unremarkable-looking amphibian that has quietly dismantled entire ecosystems across a third of the continent. And for most of that time, nothing native to Australia could touch it and survive. Then a group of researchers pointed a camera at a muddy pond edge, expecting nothing unusual, and captured footage that has since forced ecologists to rethink nearly a century of failed strategy. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back to 1935, to a sugarcane field in Queensland. Farmers were losing crops to a beetle whose larvae chewed through the roots of the cane. Someone proposed a fix that, on paper, sounded reasonable. Import a toad species from Central and South America known to eat beetles, and let nature handle the pest problem. It was framed as biological control, a clean solution requiring no chemicals and no machinery. Just over 100 cane toads were shipped in, released into the fields, and left to do their job. They did not do their job. The beetles lived high on the cane stalks, far above where a heavy, ground-bound toad could ever reach. The two species barely crossed paths. But the toads were not particular eaters. They turned to whatever was within striking distance. Insects, small reptiles, frogs, even fledgling birds. And they bred at a pace that stunned everyone who had approved the release. Within decades, the founding population of just over 100 animals had exploded into the hundreds of millions. They pushed outward from Queensland into the Northern Territory, then into Western Australia, advancing at a rate ecologists have compared to a slow-moving tide, roughly 40 kilometers a year in some regions, faster in others as natural selection began favoring the boldest, longest-legged individuals at the invasion front. What made the toads so devastating was not aggression. It was chemistry. Behind their heads sit paired glands that secrete a milky toxin potent enough to stop the heart of almost any predator that bites down. Australia's native carnivores had never encountered anything like it. Snakes, goannas, freshwater crocodiles, and quolls had spent millions of years evolving in isolation, developing instincts finely tuned to local prey, but with zero defense against a toxin this specific. When a predator saw a toad, it saw an easy, slow-moving meal. It struck. Within minutes, in many cases, it was dead. The northern quoll, a spotted marsupial roughly the size of a small housecat, was pushed to the edge of local extinction across huge stretches of its range. Yellow-spotted monitor lizards, once common along river systems, vanished almost entirely from areas the toads reached. Freshwater crocodile populations in some rivers collapsed so sharply that field researchers could track the die-off almost month by month. And when apex predators disappear, the effects ripple downward through the entire food web. Prey species that had once been kept in check by those predators surged. Feral cats and foxes, already a serious problem for native wildlife, found new openings to exploit. The invasion was never really about one species eating another. It was a slow unraveling of an entire ecological structure that had taken millions of years to build. For decades, the response from wildlife agencies and volunteer groups was determined but limited. Long toad exclusion fences were constructed in an attempt to slow the westward spread. Community toad-busting nights became a fixture in parts of Queensland and the Northern Territory, with volunteers collecting toads by the thousands using buckets, gloves, and headlamps. Researchers experimented with traps that mimicked the toads' mating calls to lure adults away from breeding sites. There was serious scientific work on training native predators to associate the smell of a cane toad with nausea, using small non-lethal toxin doses, an approach known as conditioned taste aversion, which produced encouraging results in some quoll and goanna populations. Scientists also explored genetic approaches aimed at limiting toad fertility. Each method had value on a small scale. None of them scaled to match the size of a continent. Then came the discovery that changed the conversation entirely, and it came from watching, not intervening. A team of ecologists working in the Northern Territory, including researchers associated with work led by Georgia Ward Fear and Rick Shine, both long recognized for their extensive published research on cane toad ecology and invasive species management in Australia, set out to observe the vulnerable early life stage of cane toads, the point at which tadpoles complete metamorphosis and emerge from the water as tiny, fingernail-sized toadlets. This stage had always been considered a moment of relative safety for the species, since native predators had learned, often at great cost, to avoid adult toads entirely, and the babies were assumed to inherit that same protective avoidance from other animals. What the researchers documented instead was something no one had formally recorded before. Meat ants, an aggressive and highly social species found throughout tropical northern Australia, were not avoiding the baby toads. They were actively hunting them. Rather than a single ant biting and retreating, teams of ants converged on individual toadlets from multiple directions at once, holding on despite the toxins leaching from the toad's skin, and dismantling the animal while it was still alive. The behavior was coordinated in a way that suggested organized recruitment rather than opportunistic scavenging. The reason this worked came down to basic toad instinct meeting an evolutionary blind spot. When most native predators bite a cane toad, the toad's defense is simple: sit still and let the toxin do its work. In its native range in South America, that strategy is effective, because it evolved specifically to overwhelm the physiology of local predators there. But meat ants do not have the circulatory or nervous system architecture the toxin is built to attack. Their bodies simply are not vulnerable to it in the same way. So while the toad remains frozen, waiting for a threat that will never materialize, the ants continue their work undisturbed. It is not a fair fight, and it was never supposed to happen in the first place, because meat ants and cane toads had never evolved alongside each other. The numbers that came out of this research were the part that made the wider scientific community sit up. In certain observed areas, meat ant predation was accounting for as much as 98% of emerging toadlet mortality. That is not an incremental improvement. In population terms, if a species loses the overwhelming majority of its offspring at the earliest and most vulnerable life stage, before those individuals can even reach reproductive age, the entire trajectory of that population can shift. A single female cane toad can lay somewhere between 8,000 and 30,000 eggs in one clutch, and the toad's survival strategy has always depended on the sheer scale of that reproduction outweighing the losses. Meat ants had found a way to attack that math directly. There was, however, a very real limitation baked into the discovery. Meat ants could only take down the newly emerged toadlets, the ones still small, soft-skinned, and biologically unprepared for combat. A fully grown adult cane toad, which can weigh close to 2 kilograms and grow to roughly the size of a dinner plate, is essentially untouchable. Its skin is thick, its toxin reserves are far larger, and it can simply walk away from an ant assault without consequence. The ants were never going to solve the adult toad problem. What they could do was cut off the supply line, reducing the number of toadlets that ever survived long enough to become the next generation of breeding adults. The second obstacle researchers ran into was geography. Meat ant colonies were not evenly distributed across the landscape, and in many of the areas where cane toads were actively breeding and expanding their range, ant density simply was not high enough to make a dent in toadlet survival. The ants were winning the battles they were present for. They just were not present everywhere the fight was happening. The solution researchers arrived at was almost absurdly simple, and it is the detail that tends to surprise people most when they hear this story for the first time. Scientists needed a way to draw large numbers of meat ants to specific pond edges at the precise moment toadlets were emerging. The answer turned out to be ordinary tinned cat food, the cheap, oily, fish-based kind sold in supermarkets across the country. Researchers opened cans and placed them along the muddy banks of breeding ponds. Within minutes, meat ants converged on the scent in large numbers, establishing what functioned as a defensive perimeter around the water's edge. The effect on predation rates was immediate and measurable. In baited areas, ant density increased several times over compared to untreated sites, and the survival odds for emerging toadlets dropped sharply. In some documented cases, Nearly every toadlet attempting to leave the water in a baited zone was killed within its first few hops onto land. The bait did not need to harm a single toad directly. It only needed to keep a concentrated ant force stationed at the exact spot and moment where the toads were most exposed. There is a second layer to why this approach works so well, one tied to the toad's own biology. Cane toads absorb almost all of their hydration through their skin rather than by drinking, which means they are tethered closely to water sources, especially in their first hours and days on land. If a defensive wall of ants prevents a toadlet from settling near the pond edge, even pushing it back only a short distance, dehydration becomes a serious threat within hours. Heat, water dependency, and a concentrated ant presence combine into a kind of natural choke point that no fence or mechanical trap had ever managed to replicate. What makes the discovery remarkable from a conservation standpoint is the cost. Protecting a single breeding pond with this method requires little more than a few dollars of tinned cat food, compared to the substantial public funding that has gone into fencing projects, mechanical traps, and genetic research over the decades. Conservation groups and land management teams in the Northern Territory have already begun applying the technique around ecologically sensitive sites, including wetlands near vulnerable quoll populations, using it as a low-cost, targeted defense rather than a blanket solution. Alongside the meat ant discovery, researchers have observed something almost as striking happening within the cane toad population itself. Toads at the leading edge of the invasion front, the animals actively expanding into new territory, have been documented developing measurably longer hind legs than toads in long-established populations further behind. This isn't folklore. Published research on the invasion front has tracked shifts in leg length and locomotor performance over successive generations, consistent with rapid, ongoing natural selection favoring the fastest, most dispersal-capable individuals. Toads at the front tend to be leaner, faster, and more willing to move through open, unfamiliar terrain, essentially because more cautious individuals get left behind generation after generation while the boldest ones keep pushing the boundary of the invasion outward. At the same time, some ecologists have begun asking whether meat ant colonies in long-invaded areas are becoming more efficient hunters of toadlets specifically, whether through learned recruitment patterns passed along colony pheromone trails or through some degree of genuine behavioral adaptation. That question remains open and is the subject of ongoing study, but the pattern researchers have noted, colonies near ponds with a long history of toad breeding responding faster and more aggressively to toadlet presence than colonies with no prior exposure, is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The meat ant is not the only native species learning to fight back. Some crow populations in eastern Australia have been observed flipping cane toads onto their backs and feeding on the underside, avoiding the toxin glands entirely. Water rats along rivers in the Kimberley region have developed a strikingly precise feeding technique, removing the toxic organs before consuming the rest of the toad, a behavior so clean that early observers mistook the remains for the work of poachers rather than rodents. Certain ibis populations appear to rinse toads in water repeatedly before swallowing them, diluting the toxin load. None of these behaviors were documented 20 years ago. Slowly, unevenly, across different species and different regions, the continent appears to be adapting to a threat it was never built to face. None of this means the invasion is over. Cane toads continue to expand westward, and adult toads remain just as lethal to any predator naive enough to attack one. The most optimistic researchers involved in this work describe the meat ant discovery not as a cure, but as the first real native counterweight the country has found in nearly a century of trying. It will not undo the damage already done to quoll populations, goanna numbers, or freshwater crocodile habitats. What it may do, if applied at scale, is slow the machine that keeps producing the next generation of toads, one pond, one can of cat food, one colony of ants at a time. When the original findings on meat ant predation were first published, the response among some senior ecologists was skepticism. The numbers seemed too favorable, the mechanism too tidy. The idea that a can of supermarket cat food could meaningfully influence an ecological catastrophe of this scale felt almost dismissive of decades of expensive, high-tech effort. But replication after replication, the pattern held. It forced a quiet, uncomfortable reassessment across the field, that sometimes the most effective response to an enormous problem is not a bigger intervention, but closer attention to something small that had been working in the background all along, waiting to be noticed. Whether this discovery is enough to change the long-term trajectory of the invasion will likely take another 20 or 30 years to fully answer. The toads are still spreading. The ants are still fighting. And for the first time in almost a century, Australia has documented proof that nature itself found a weapon no laboratory had thought